The year 1945 marked the endpoint of Adolf Hitler's grand dream and the brutal power of Nazi Germany. After years of creating horror in Europe, Germany finally succumbed to the Allied forces. Soviet troops stormed from the east, while the United States, Britain, and France rolled in from the west. After Germany's defeat in the World War, the Allies immediately arrested key Nazi figures who had been responsible for the brutal crimes committed. This arrest operation targeted high-ranking SS officials, concentration camp leaders, military doctors, and scientists who had misused their knowledge. And one of them was Karl Franz Gebhardt, Heinrich Himmler's former personal physician who was involved in cruel experiments in concentration camps. Karl Gebhardt was born on November 23, 1897, in Haag, Upper Bavaria, in the Bavaria region of the German Empire. Gebhardt's youth coincided with the outbreak of World War I. He participated in the war as a young soldier, so that when the war ended in 1918, he already had military experience as a war veteran. The fervent nationalism that arose after the war influenced his political views. While a medical student after the war, Gebhardt actively supported right-wing nationalist movements and was involved in the Freikorps Oberland paramilitary group. In November 1923, Gebhardt even took part in the Beer Hall Putsch, a failed coup led by Adolf Hitler in Munich. His involvement in the political turmoil of post-World War I Germany shaped Gebhardt's ideological beliefs and marked the beginning of his close association with the Nazi movement. After World War I ended, Gebhardt pursued higher education in medicine. He began studying medicine in Munich in 1919. Gebhardt graduated and earned his doctorate, and in 1924 began working as an assistant physician at the surgical clinic of the University of Munich. In this early phase of his career, he had the opportunity to learn from leading German surgeons. Gebhardt trained under the guidance of Professor Ferdinand Sauerbruch and Erich Lexer. His reputation as a surgeon grew rapidly. He achieved habilitation in 1932, which allowed him to become a lecturer or professor. As a young academic, Karl Gebhardt excelled in the field of sports medicine and medical rehabilitation. He made significant contributions to the development of physical medicine and rehabilitation science in Germany. During the interwar period between the 1920s and early 1930s, his name was respected as a professor and a leading orthopedic expert. He was particularly recognized as an expert in treating knee injuries and was known as a pioneer of medical rehabilitation for disabled patients. Several high-ranking German figures at the time, even King Leopold III of Belgium, were recorded to have undergone medical treatment at Gebhardt's hands. Gebhardt began to be officially involved with the Nazi movement shortly after Adolf Hitler came to power. He joined the Nazi Party on May 1, 1933. Gebhardt, who was already established in the medical world at that time, was then directed to lead health institutions under the new regime. In 1935, he moved to Berlin, and in the same year joined the SS. The Nazi regime appointed him as the medical superintendent of Hohenlychen Sanatorium in Uckermark, a hospital originally dedicated to treating tuberculosis patients. Gebhardt transformed Hohenlychen from a tuberculosis sanatorium into an orthopedic and sports rehabilitation clinic. Gebhardt quickly became an important figure in the field of sports medicine within the Nazi regime. Gebhardt gained further recognition when he was appointed as the head of the medical department at the 1936 Berlin Olympics, serving as the senior physician for the competing athletes. His career reached its peak in 1938 when he was appointed as the personal physician to Heinrich Himmler, the supreme leader of the SS. This close relationship with Himmler further solidified Gebhardt's influence and rank within the Nazi hierarchy. When World War II broke out in 1939, Gebhardt held various important positions. He was appointed chief surgeon of the staff of the Reich and led the conversion of the Hohenlychen Sanatorium into a military hospital for the elite Waffen-SS troops. In May 1942, a significant event occurred that became a turning point in Gebhardt's career. Reinhard Heydrich, a high-ranking Nazi official and Himmler's right-hand man, was injured by a bomb in an assassination attempt in Prague on May 27, 1942. On the direct orders of Heinrich Himmler, Karl Gebhardt was immediately flown to Prague to lead the emergency treatment of the severely wounded Hydricch. Several days after the surgery, Hydrick's condition worsened with a high fever due to infection. Theodor Morell, Adolf Hitler's personal physician, suggested the use of sulfonamide to treat Hydrickchs infection. However, Gebhardt rejected this advice, believing that conventional surgical methods and the body's natural immunity were sufficient to cure Hydrickchs without the aid of antibiotics. This decision turned out to be a fatal mistake. Hydrickchs' wounds became severely infected, and Hydrickchs died on June 4, 1942. The failure to save such an important figure as Hydrickchs put immense pressure on Gebhardt. Himmler did not openly blame Gebhardt, but he urged his subordinate to redeem this failure through scientific means. Himmler proposed that Gebhardt conduct medical experiments that would prove that the antibiotic sulfonamide was indeed ineffective in treating gangrenous infections, thus justifying Gebhardt's decision not to use it on Hydrickchs. This directive then became the basis for Gebhardt to conduct a series of cruel medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners. During World War II, Karl Gebhardt led various medical and surgical experiments on prisoners in Nazi concentration camps, particularly in the Ravensbrück and Sachsenhausen camps. Gebhardt focused his experiments on attempting to prove that the drug sulfonamide was useless in treating infections. To this end, severe infection scenarios similar to war wounds were deliberately engineered on the bodies of the prisoners. As a first step, Gebhardt and his team of assistants conducted preliminary trials at the Sachsenhausen camp. Approximately 20 male prisoners in Sachsenhausen were used as initial subjects, where SS doctors made incisions 5 to 8 centimeters long on the lower legs of the prisoners, and then inserted bacterial cultures into the wounds. The wounds were then stitched closed, and infection began to develop. This initial experiment was to determine the appropriate method for creating infection. Once the infection method was deemed ready, Gebhardt moved the experiments to the Ravensbrück camp on a larger scale and with more vulnerable victims. Starting in 1942, a series of forced experiments began on approximately 60 young female prisoners in Ravensbrück. According to the scenario designed by Gebhardt, SS doctors deliberately injured the prisoners. The legs or limbs of these young women were surgically cut open, their bones were broken, and then the wounds were infected with various dangerous bacteria that cause gangrene. To create infection conditions as similar as possible to battlefield wounds on the front lines, Gebhardt's team added dirt to the wounds. The wounds were sprinkled with wood splinters, pieces of glass, soil, as well as pieces of dirty cloth, simulating the filth that often adhered to the wounds of soldiers on the battlefield. After the infection appeared to develop, some victims were given sulfonamide drugs, while others were left completely untreated, as a comparison group. Gebhardt then observed the difference in conditions between the treated and untreated groups. In reality, both groups suffered equally. The unfortunate women experienced high fevers, excruciating pain, and severe infections in their wounds. Many of the victims suffered horrific sepsis, with pus and decay in the deliberately inflicted wounds. Gebhardt's experiments did not stop at wound infections alone. He and his team also performed bone and muscle transplantation surgeries on the female prisoners of Ravensbrück. At least 3 types of experimental surgeries were performed, among them breaking the victim's bones, then attempting to transplant bone or muscle tissue back, as well as taking bone fragments from one part of the body to another. The supposed aim was to study the process of bone regeneration and wound healing. In reality, these operations were extremely brutal and far beyond the bounds of humanity. The victims' bones were struck with hammers and chisels until they fractured, and then the surgical wounds were merely stitched and put in a cast for a few days, after which the casts were forcibly removed to observe how the healing process progressed. However, towards the defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945, Karl Gebhardt was still involved in the regime's final efforts. However, when the war ended, the traces of his crimes could no longer be hidden. Gebhardt was arrested by the United States shortly after Germany surrendered. He was then named as a key defendant in the doctors' trial in Nuremberg against 20 doctors and 3 Nazi medical officials who were charged with war crimes. In the indictment, Gebhardt was accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity, including murder, torture, and illegal medical experiments on prisoners. On August 20, 1947, Karl Gebhardt was found guilty on all charges, and he was sentenced to death. On June 2, 1948, Gebhardt's death sentence was carried out. He was executed by hanging at Landsberg Prison, Bavaria.